Imagine this. You're serving wine at an elite gala, surrounded by billionaires in $1,000 suits. One of them mocks you publicly, saying the bottle in your hands costs more than your entire year's salary. The room erupts in laughter. Everyone expects you to stay silent, bow your head, and walk away. But what if you didn't? What if, instead, you spoke just one sentence that would bring down his entire empire? This is the incredible true story of Eleanor Carter, a waitress, whose single sentence destroyed a billionaire's arrogance and changed her life forever. By the end of this video, you'll understand why respect truly costs nothing, but arrogance can cost you everything. The sterling grand ballroom glimmered like captured stars that night. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, while the city's richest and most powerful gathered in their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. The air was thick with expensive cologne, champagne bubbles, and the kind of laughter that only comes when you know you're untouchable. Tonight wasn't just any dinner party. This was the launch celebration for Kareem Al-Mansour's newest billion-dollar venture. A man whose name commanded respect in boardrooms from Dubai to Manhattan. Oil magnate, tech mogul, and real estate emperor. Kareem had built an empire that stretched across continents. At 42, he was worth more than some small country's GDP. But money hadn't just made Kareem powerful, it had made him cruel. Moving quietly between the golden tables was Eleanor Carter, a 26-year-old waitress whose tired eyes held stories that none of these wealthy guests would ever understand. Her black uniform was perfectly pressed, though if you looked closely, you could see the careful stitches where she'd mended a small tear at the hem. Her movements were graceful, practiced, the result of years spent invisible in rooms full of people who looked through her. Rather than at her dot, Eleanor had learned long ago that in the world of the wealthy, staff were like furniture, functional, necessary, but not worth acknowledging. She'd served at hundreds of events like this, absorbing insults with trained smiles, swallowing her dignity to keep her job. But tonight would be different. Tonight, years of accumulated humiliation would finally find their voice. The evening began like any other. Eleanor approached Kareem's table carrying a bottle of vintage wine, worth more than most people's monthly rent. Kareem was in his element, holding court with investors from 3 continents. His voice booming with stories of his genius business instincts and natural superiority. His laugh was sharp, cutting through conversations at nearby tables like a blade. When Eleanor leaned forward to pour the deep crimson liquid, Kareem's predatory gaze fixed on her. A cruel smile spread across his face, the kind of smile that meant someone was about to be humiliated for sport. "Careful there, sweetheart," he said loudly enough for the entire table to hear, his voice dripping with condescension. "Don't spill it. This bottle costs more than your entire year's salary." The table erupted in laughter. Investors chuckled behind their napkins. Some covered their mouths in mock embarrassment while others smirked openly, feeding off their host's cruelty. The sound spread like wildfire, infecting nearby tables where guests who hadn't even heard the full remark joined in, laughing simply because the billionaire had set the tone. Eleanor's cheeks flushed, but her hands remained steady. The wine flowed perfectly into each glass, not a single drop wasted. She had heard worse. She had endured worse, but something was building inside her, a pressure that had been accumulating for years. Crane wasn't finished. "Do you even know what this is?" he mocked, holding up the bottle like a trophy. "This isn't the cheap swill you people drink in back alleys. This is Chateau Le Pin 1982. Art, class, culture. Something you could never understand, no matter how many tables you serve. More laughter, more cruel, empty laughter that echoed off the crystal chandeliers and marble walls." Eleanor placed the bottle back on her tray. For a moment, she considered walking away. Enduring humiliation was, after all, part of the unspoken job description when serving the wealthy. Keep your head down, smile, take the money, survive another day. But something deep inside her, a flame long suppressed by years of invisibility, suddenly roared to life. She straightened her back. Her dark eyes met Kareem's, calm and steady, unafraid. And then, in a voice neither loud nor timid, but perfectly clear, she spoke words that would echo round the world. "Sir, a bottle of wine may be worth a year of my salary, but respect costs you nothing, and somehow you can't afford even that." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The laughter died as if someone had flipped a switch. Glasses paused mid-air. Forks hovered above plates. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The air itself seemed to still, heavy with the weight of truth spoken in a room built on pretense. Kareem blinked, his cruel smirk faltering. For the first time that evening, perhaps the first time in years, words completely deserted him. Around the room, guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked at Eleanor with surprise, others with quiet admiration. A few even dared to clap softly before catching themselves, fearful of Kareem's inevitable wrath. But it was too late. The sentence had landed like a precision-guided missile, sharp, undeniable, unforgettable. In that single moment, Eleanor Carter, invisible waitress, forgotten worker, dismissed human being, had shattered the illusion of invincibility that Kareem Al-Mansour had spent his entire life constructing. He had billions of dollars, private jets, political connections, and the power to destroy lives with a phone call. She had only her dignity and her truth. But in that moment, standing in that glittering ballroom surrounded by the world's elite, it was her words, not his wealth, that ruled the room. And this was only the beginning of Kareem Al-Mansour's downfall. To understand why Eleanor's words cut so deep, you need to understand who Kareem Al-Mansour really was beneath the designer suits and carefully crafted public image. Born into wealth in Dubai, Kareem inherited his father's oil fortune at 25. But that was just the beginning. Where others might have been content to maintain generational wealth, Kareem was driven by an insatiable hunger for more money, more power, more control. He expanded aggressively into technology, acquiring startups before they could become competitors. He bought luxury resorts across the Mediterranean, turning them into playgrounds for the global elite. His private equity firm purchased struggling companies, stripped them for parts, and sold the pieces for massive profits. By 40, Kareem controlled a business empire worth over $8 billion. His face graced magazine covers with headlines like "The Midas Touch" and "The King of Global Business." Financial journals quoted his every prediction. Politicians sought his endorsements. Universities offered him honorary degrees he never bothered to accept. But success hadn't just made Kareem wealthy, it had made him monstrous. Kareem genuinely believed that money wasn't just power, it was proof of inherent superiority. In his mind, the universe was divided into two types of people: those who mattered the wealthy and those who existed solely to serve them everyone else. He never spoke to waiters, drivers, clerks, or cleaning staff. He spoke at them, giving orders like a master commanding servants to him. Poor people weren't just unfortunate, they were inferior. Their poverty was evidence of their weakness, their lack of ambition, their fundamental unworthiness. He saw kindness as weakness and empathy as a luxury only the successful could afford to fake. His cruelty wasn't accidental, it was systematic. At business meetings, he would deliberately humiliate junior employees to establish dominance. He once fired an entire marketing team via group text while they were presenting to clients, then laughed about it at dinner parties. His personal assistant quit after he berated her for 20 minutes because his coffee was 2 degrees too cold. Kareem collected humiliations the way other people collected art. He remembered every cruel comment, every moment of fear he'd instilled, every time he'd made someone smaller to make himself feel larger. It wasn't enough to be rich. He needed others to suffer for not being rich. The press, hungry for access to his wealth and influence, largely ignored these stories. His PR team worked overtime to craft an image of a demanding but brilliant businessman, a perfectionist whose high standards drove innovation. The few journalists who dared question his methods found their access cut off, and their careers mysteriously stalled. So, when Eleanor Carter dared to challenge him in that ballroom, it wasn't just defiance, it was revolution. For 20 years, Kareem had wielded his wealth like a weapon, crushing anyone who dared suggest he wasn't a god among mortals. The idea that a waitress, someone he considered barely human, could speak to him as an equal was so foreign, so threatening to his entire worldview, that it triggered something primal in him. This wasn't just about wounded pride. This was about the fundamental order of his universe being challenged by someone who, in his mind, had no right to even look him in the eye, let alone judge him. And that made Eleanor Carter the most dangerous person in Kareem Al-Mansour's world. But who was Eleanor Carter? What creates the kind of person who can face down a billionaire with nothing but truth and dignity? Eleanor grew up in Riverside, a neighborhood where broken streetlights outnumbered working ones, and the sound of police sirens was more familiar than lullabies. It was a place where dreams were luxuries few could afford, where most people worked 2 jobs just to pay rent, and where dignity was often the only thing you owned that couldn't be repossessed. Her earliest memories were of her mother, Maria, humming Spanish lullabies while folding other people's laundry late into the night, and her father, Carlos, returning from construction sites with hands blistered and eyes weary, but spirit unbroken. Money was always tight, but love was abundant. The Carter family might not have had much, but they had each other. When Eleanor was 9, she witnessed something that would shape her forever. Her father had just finished renovating a wealthy client's bathroom. Weeks of backbreaking work installing imported Italian marble. When the man came to inspect the job, he found fault with everything. The grout lines weren't perfectly straight. The tiles weren't aligned to his satisfaction. The work was clearly substandard. He refused to pay the full amount, offering half of what was agreed upon. Carlos Carter stood in that expensive bathroom, sweat stains on his work shirt, concrete dust in his hair, and listened to this wealthy man insult his craftsmanship. The money he was being denied would mean Eleanor's school clothes would have to wait another month. It meant beans and rice for dinner instead of the small luxuries that made poverty bearable. The wealthy client, seeing Carlos's desperation, pulled out his wallet and offered a $20 tip. "For your trouble," he said with a condescending smile, as if this pathetic gesture would somehow make up for stealing hundreds of dollars of honest wages. Eleanor watched her father look at that $20 bill, money they desperately needed, and then look at the man offering it. Carlos straightened his shoulders, looked the client directly in the eye, and said with quiet dignity, "You don't get to steal my wages and then buy my silence with pocket change. Keep your money. I'd rather keep my respect." The wealthy man sneered, muttering insults as Carlos packed his tools. But Eleanor's father walked out of that house with his head high, his dignity intact. That night, Eleanor asked him why he'd turned down money they so badly needed. Her father smiled sadly and said words that would echo in her heart for decades. "Because respect, my little star, costs nothing, and if a man can't give it freely, no amount of money will make it real." Those words became Eleanor's foundation. Through years of struggle, through countless moments when the world tried to break her, she carried her father's lesson. Respect isn't something you beg for or buy. It's something you demand simply by being human. Eleanor wasn't just hardworking. She was brilliant. At 16, she won a local essay competition with a piece titled "The Invisible Backbone," about the unnoticed workers who kept society running. Teachers urged her to apply for scholarships, to dream of college, to imagine a future beyond the limitations of her zip code. She dreamed of studying literature, maybe becoming a writer, traveling to all the places she'd only read about in library books. She filled notebooks with stories, crafted essays that made her teachers weep, and planned for a future that seemed suddenly, miraculously possible. But when Eleanor was 17, her mother was diagnosed with cancer. Suddenly, college applications seemed absurd when hospital bills were piling up like snowflakes in a blizzard. Eleanor put aside her dreams, picked up double shifts at a local diner, and spent her nights not studying for SATs, but holding her mother's hand. Through chemotherapy sessions, she promised herself it was temporary, just until Mom got better, just until the bills were manageable, just until things stabilized. But days became months, months became years, and the girl with essays in her notebook became the young woman balancing trays at the Sterling Grand Ballroom. Her younger brother Michael became her world after their mother passed. Eleanor woke him for school every morning, packed his lunches with the care of a mother, tutored him late into the night when his homework proved challenging. When he struggled with math, she found free workbooks at yard sales. When he wanted to play soccer, she saved tips for cleats. even when it meant walking to work instead of taking the bus. Michael once asked her, "Eleanor, why do you work so much?" She was exhausted, her feet aching from a 14-hour shift, her back sore from carrying heavy trays. But she smiled and said, "Because one day you'll go places I couldn't, and I'll know every sacrifice was worth it." Though she never enrolled in university, Eleanor never stopped learning. Library books became her professors. She devoured novels, history volumes, philosophy texts, and poetry collections. Her co-workers sometimes laughed. "Why bother reading? You'll never get out of here anyway." But Eleanor understood something they didn't. For her, knowledge wasn't about escape. It was about dignity. Each page she read reminded her that she was more than her uniform, more than her paycheck, more than other people's assumptions about her worth. Eleanor also had a gift for languages. From Spanish-speaking co-workers, she learned conversational phrases. From elderly Arab neighbors, she mastered basic Arabic. She even taught herself French through library CDs, practicing pronunciation while walking to work. For Eleanor, every new language was a bridge to someone else's humanity, another way to connect across the artificial barriers that society created. This quiet accumulation of knowledge, dignity, and cultural understanding was what made her response to Kareem so devastating. She hadn't just spoken English in that ballroom. She had spoken the universal language of human worth. So when people later asked how a simple waitress could face down a billionaire, they misunderstood the question entirely. Eleanor Carter wasn't just a waitress any more than Kareem Al-Mansour was just rich. She was a woman who had been forged by struggle, refined by sacrifice, and armored in a kind of dignity that no amount of money could buy. And when Kareem tried to strip her of respect, she reminded him, and the world, that respect was never his to give or take away. The morning after the gala, Kareem Al-Mansour woke up in his penthouse suite to a nightmare he'd never imagined possible. His phone was buzzing with notifications, his email was flooded with messages, and his PR team was in full panic mode. Someone at the gala had recorded Eleanor's response on their phone. The video was grainy, the audio slightly muffled, but her words rang out crystal clear. Respect costs you nothing, and somehow you can't afford even that. Within 6 hours, the clip had been viewed 50,000 times. By noon, it had hit 1 million. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded. Memes were created. The phrase "respect costs nothing" began trending worldwide. For the first time in his life, Kareem Al-Mansour wasn't controlling the narrative. He was the victim of it. His first instinct was to crush the story completely. He called his PR firm, screaming into the phone at 6 a.m. "Delete it. Wipe it from every platform. That woman will not make a fool of me." "Sir, it's already been mirrored across thousands of accounts," his publicist explained nervously. "Once something goes viral, it's virtually impossible to contain. The best we can do is spin the narrative. I don't want spin." Kareem roared, "I want that video gone, and I want that waitress destroyed." But the internet doesn't work like a boardroom. You can't intimidate it into compliance or buy its silence. Every attempt to remove the video only drew more attention to it. Eleanor's words had taken on a life of their own. Within 24 hours, Kareem's team launched a coordinated counterattack. Anonymous sources suddenly appeared, claiming Eleanor was a disgruntled employee with a history of seeking attention. Tabloid articles materialized with headlines like "Waitress Fabricates Story for Fame and Billionaire. Victim of Publicity Stunt." Photos of Eleanor, taken without her knowledge or consent, appeared alongside cruel speculation about her motives, her background, and her character. The internet can be a weapon, and Kareem was wielding it with the precision of someone who'd spent years destroying his enemies. At Sterling Grand, the atmosphere grew toxic overnight. Eleanor's manager avoided eye contact when giving her shifts. Co-workers who had been friendly suddenly found excuses to avoid her. Some were afraid of being caught in the crossfire. Others genuinely believed the smear campaign and saw her as a troublemaker who'd brought unwanted attention to their workplace. Eleanor tried to focus on her work, but she felt the stares everywhere. Whispered conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Tables she served seemed more demanding than usual, as if they were testing her, looking for signs that she was the attention-seeking fraud the headlines described. The pressure was suffocating. Eleanor had expected Kareem to be angry, but she hadn't anticipated the systematic campaign to destroy her reputation. Every day brought new lies, new accusations, new attempts to paint her as everything she wasn't. But then something unexpected happened. For every cruel comment about Eleanor online, two supportive ones appeared. For every article attacking her character, bloggers and journalists wrote pieces defending her courage. The video of her words wasn't just going viral. It was inspiring people. A teacher in Ohio shared it with her students, talking about the importance of speaking up to bullies. A nurse in London posted it on her break room bulletin board. A construction worker in Mexico translated it into Spanish and sent it to his daughter, telling her this was what courage looked like. Eleanor's single sentence had become a rallying cry for everyone who'd ever felt powerless. In the face of wealth and privilege, suddenly, she wasn't just a waitress who'd stood up to a rude customer. She was a symbol of dignity in an undignified world. The momentum kept building. Talk shows debated the incident. Late-night comedians made jokes about billionaires who couldn't afford respect. T-shirts with Eleanor's quote appeared in stores. The phrase was translated into dozens of languages, shared by people who'd never heard of Kareem Al-Mansour, but understood exactly what Eleanor had been fighting against. And through it all, Eleanor remained remarkably centered. When reporters tried to interview her, she politely declined. When offers for TV appearances came in, she turned them down. She hadn't spoken those words for fame or money. She'd spoken them because they needed to be said. At home, Michael watched his sister weather the storm with admiration that bordered on awe. "How are you so calm?" he asked one evening as they ate dinner while news anchors discussed her story. On their small television, Eleanor smiled tiredly. "Because I said what was true, and truth doesn't need defending. It just needs to be spoken." But Kareem Al-Mansour was far from finished. The billionaire had built his empire by crushing opposition. And he wasn't about to let a waitress topple him. If public opinion was turning against him, he would use the one weapon that had never failed him: raw, overwhelming power. The real battle was just beginning. Kareem Al-Mansour had faced down hostile takeovers, survived market crashes, and emerged victorious from boardroom battles that had destroyed lesser men. But he'd never faced anything like this. A waitress, a nobody, had become an international symbol of his humiliation. Every day the story lived on was another day his carefully constructed image crumbled. His response was swift and merciless. Within a week, Eleanor received an eviction notice. Her landlord, a nervous man who'd always been friendly, could barely look at her as he delivered it. "I'm sorry, Eleanor, but there's been too much attention. Reporters, photographers. I can't risk the trouble it might bring to other tenants." The notice gave her 30 days to find a new place in a city where rents were already beyond her means, and her sudden notoriety made her a liability. No landlord wanted to risk it. Then came the lawsuit. Kareem sued Eleanor for defamation, demanding $20 million in damages. The legal papers, delivered by courier in an intimidating manila envelope, claimed that her false and malicious statements had damaged his reputation and cost him business opportunities. Eleanor stared at the lawsuit, her hands trembling. $20 million. She didn't have $20 to spare most months. The legal fees alone would bankrupt her even if she won. Kareem wasn't just trying to silence her. He was trying to bury her so completely that she'd never be able to crawl out. At Sterling Grand, the pressure intensified. Eleanor's hours were cut without explanation. Shifts she'd worked for years were suddenly given to other servers. When she asked why, management claimed it was about liability concerns and maintaining a professional environment. Her co-workers' behavior ranged from sympathetic to hostile. Some whispered encouragement when supervisors weren't looking, but others openly resented her for bringing negative attention to their workplace. The kitchen, once filled with friendly banter, became a minefield of tense silences and avoided glances. But Kareem's most devastating weapon was character assassination. His team had hired private investigators to dig into Eleanor's past, and they were creative with what they found. A parking ticket from 3 years ago became evidence of her disregard for rules. A customer complaint about slow service was twisted into proof of her poor work ethic. They found a photo of her to protest against gentrification and painted her as a radical activist with an anti-business agenda. The smear campaign was relentless and sophisticated. Fake social media accounts spread rumors about Eleanor's personal life. Anonymous comments on news articles claimed she was everything from mentally unstable to a foreign agent trying to undermine American business. Most cruel of all, they targeted her family. Articles appeared suggesting that Michael's academic achievements were fabricated, that Eleanor had somehow gamed the system to get him scholarships he didn't deserve. The implication was clear. The entire Carter family were frauds, liars, people who couldn't be trusted. Eleanor had endured years of humiliation from wealthy customers. But this was different. This was systematic. This was designed not just to hurt her, but to erase her completely, to make her story disappear by destroying her credibility as a human being. The stress was overwhelming. Eleanor lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Dark circles appeared under her eyes. Her usually perfect posture began to sag under the weight of constant anxiety. Michael watched his sister, his hero, his protector, struggle in a way that terrified him. "Maybe I should just apologize," Eleanor whispered one night as they sat in their small kitchen. Legal papers scattered on the table between them. "Maybe if I say I was wrong, he'll leave us alone." Michael's response was immediate and fierce. "No, Eleanor. You told the truth. If you apologize for telling the truth, what does that say to everyone who believed in you? What does it say to me?" His words reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten in the chaos. She hadn't just spoken for herself that night. She'd spoken for everyone who'd ever been dismissed, disrespected, or dehumanized by people with power. Backing down now wouldn't just be surrender, it would be betrayal. But Kareem had underestimated something crucial about Eleanor Carter. The same struggles that had shaped her strength had also taught her how to endure. She'd survived poverty, family illness, and years of invisible indignities. She'd learned to find hope in dark places and dignity in desperate circumstances. More importantly, she wasn't alone anymore. The viral video had connected her to millions of people who understood exactly what she'd faced in that ballroom. Strangers sent messages of support. Small donations appeared in a legal defense fund someone had started without her knowledge. Lawyers offered to take her case pro bono. Eleanor's story had become bigger than her personal battle with Kareem. It had become a referendum on power, privilege, and the price of speaking truth to authority. And as Kareem was about to learn, when you try to destroy someone who represents hope to millions of people, you don't just fight that person, you fight everyone who sees themselves in their struggle. The billionaire's revenge was about to backfire in ways he never imagined possible. The defamation trial became the most watched legal proceeding of the year. Media from around the world descended on the courthouse as Kareem Al-Mansour, flanked by a team of 7 high-powered attorneys, faced off against Eleanor Carter, who sat at the defendant's table with a single public defender and a borrowed blazer. That didn't quite fit. The visual contrast was deliberately striking. Kareem arrived each day in $1,000 suits, stepping out of a black Mercedes that cost more than most people's houses. His legal team carried briefcases that probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly rent. Everything about his presentation screamed power, authority, and the kind of influence that usually guaranteed victory in any legal battle. Eleanor, by contrast, wore the same navy blue blazer every day, borrowed from a supporter who'd heard about her situation. Her shoes were polished but clearly old, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked exactly like what she was, an ordinary working person who'd somehow found herself at the center of an extraordinary battle. But appearances can be deceiving. What most people didn't know was that Eleanor had been preparing for this moment her entire life, accumulating skills and knowledge that would prove devastatingly effective in a courtroom setting. Kareem's lawyers opened with a strategy designed to intimidate and overwhelm. They painted Eleanor as a manipulative opportunist who had deliberately provoked their client to create a viral moment that would bring her fame and financial gain. They presented charts showing the massive damage to Kareem's reputation, claiming that business deals worth hundreds of millions had fallen through. Because of Eleanor's malicious lies, lead counsel Marcus Webb, a man whose reputation for destroying witnesses was legendary, approached the stand with predatory confidence. He was used to intimidating minimum wage workers, making them stumble over their words until their stories fell apart. Miss Carter, he began with a condescending smile. You claim you were simply doing your job that night. But isn't it true that you deliberately provoked my client to create a scene? Eleanor's response was calm and measured. I poured wine and responded to disrespect. If that's provocative, perhaps the problem isn't with my actions. Webb's smile faltered slightly. He'd expected nervousness, stammering, the kind of behavior that would make a jury dismiss her as unreliable. Instead, Eleanor spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. You've never liked wealthy people, have you? Webb pressed. In fact, you have a history of resentment toward successful individuals. I don't resent success, Eleanor replied evenly. I resent cruelty. There's a difference. The lawyer tried multiple angles of attack. He questioned her education, her motives, her right to judge someone as accomplished as Kareem. But each question was met with the same unshakable calm. Eleanor wasn't just defending herself. She was embodying the dignity she'd spoken about that night. Then came the moment that changed everything. Eleanor's public defender, Sarah Martinez, was young and overworked, but she understood something Kareem's expensive legal team had missed. This case wasn't really about defamation. It was about respect, dignity, and the right of every human being to be treated with basic courtesy. Miss Carter, Martinez said gently, can you tell the court about your background with languages? Kareem's lawyers objected immediately. Relevance, Your Honor, but Judge Patricia Morrison, a stern woman with 30 years on the bench, sensed something important was coming. I'll allow it. Please answer the question, Miss Carter. Eleanor explained her self-taught knowledge of Spanish, Arabic, and French. She talked about learning languages as a way to better serve customers from different cultures, to make them feel welcome in an often unwelcoming world. Martinez then did something unexpected. She presented a series of contracts, agreements related to Kareem's business dealings, written in Arabic with English translations provided by his company. Miss Carter, could you please read this clause from the original Arabic contract and provide your own translation? The courtroom fell silent as Eleanor began to read. Her pronunciation was flawless, her voice steady. As she translated the complex legal language, gasps rippled through the gallery. This clause states that projected profits are conditional on unverifiable market assumptions and cannot be guaranteed. Any presentation of these projections as certain outcomes would constitute fraudulent misrepresentation. Kareem's face went white. His lawyers frantically whispered among themselves. The English translation his company had provided to investors said something completely different. It presented the conditional projections as guaranteed returns. Martinez presented contract after contract. Each time, Eleanor's translations revealed discrepancies between the original Arabic text and the English versions provided to American investors. Conditional clauses became guarantees. Risk warnings disappeared entirely. Projected profits based on best-case scenarios were presented as certain outcomes. What was supposed to be Eleanor's defamation trial had become an expose of Kareem's business practices. Your Honor, Kareem's lead attorney stood desperately. These translations are irrelevant to the defamation case at hand. On the contrary, Judge Morrison replied sharply, they're extremely relevant to the question of damages. If Mr. Al-Mansour's business practices are found to be fraudulent, it would be difficult to argue that Miss Carter's comments damaged a reputation that was already built on deception. The trial that was supposed to destroy Eleanor Carter was destroying Kareem Al-Mansour instead. In the hallway during a recess, Kareem cornered Eleanor, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. You think you're clever, he hissed. You have no idea what I can do to you. This isn't over. Eleanor looked at him with the same steady gaze she'd shown that night in the ballroom. You're right, she said quietly. It's not over, but not for the reasons you think. When the trial resumed, Eleanor took the stand in her own defense. Under oath, she told her story simply and honestly. She talked about growing up poor but proud, about working multiple jobs to support her brother's education, about the countless times she'd endured disrespect from wealthy customers because she needed the job. I didn't speak those words for attention or money, she testified. I spoke them because they were true, and because sometimes the truth needs to be said. Regardless of the consequences, the jury, composed of ordinary working people, not billionaire elites, saw something in Eleanor that they recognized in themselves. Here was someone who'd faced the same struggles they had, who understood what it meant to work hard for little recognition and less respect. But more importantly, they'd seen the contracts. They'd heard the translations. They understood that this case wasn't really about a rude comment at a party. It was about a powerful man trying to silence someone who'd accidentally exposed his crimes. The verdict was swift and decisive. Not guilty on all charges. The jury found that Eleanor's statement was substantially true and that Kareem had failed to prove any actual damages to his reputation that weren't the result of his own fraudulent business practices. Outside the courthouse, reporters mobbed Eleanor for comment. She stood on the steps, the same borrowed blazer slightly wrinkled from the long day, and spoke words that would become as famous as her original statement. This was never about me versus him. This was about whether truth still matters when it's spoken by someone without power, to someone with all the power in the world. Today, we got our answer, but the legal victory was just the beginning. The contracts Eleanor had translated in court had been submitted as evidence in a public proceeding. Investigators, journalists, and prosecutors now had access to documents that revealed years of fraudulent practices across Kareem's business empire. The waitress who was supposed to be silenced had instead given voice to the truth that would bring down a billionaire. Within days of the trial's conclusion, Kareem Al-Mansour's carefully constructed empire began collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. The Arabic contracts Eleanor had translated weren't just evidence in a defamation case. They were a roadmap to massive fraud that had been hidden for years by language barriers and assumptions that American investors would never bother to verify foreign language documents federal investigators launched a formal probe into Karim's business practices. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened its own investigation. International partners who had trusted English summaries of Arabic contracts realized they'd been systematically deceived. The man who had built his reputation on being a brilliant businessman was revealed as a sophisticated con artist. The first domino fell when Deutsche Bank froze Karim's assets pending investigation. Then came the avalanche. Investment partners pulled out of deals worth hundreds of millions. Stock prices for his publicly traded companies collapsed. Credit lines were cancelled. Insurance companies refused to renew policies. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. His own board of directors, Klaus Ibrahim, the silver-haired investor who'd sat quietly through the gala humiliation, called an emergency board meeting. When Karim strutted into the conference room with his usual arrogance, expecting to control the narrative as he always had, he found something unprecedented: resistance. "Karim," Klaus said without preamble, "we've been reviewing contracts for the past week. Every Arabic document tells a different story than the English translations you provided." Miss Carter wasn't just defending herself in that courtroom. She was exposing fraud that goes back years. Around the mahogany table, faces that had once smiled at Karim's jokes and applauded his success now looked at him with disgust and betrayal. These weren't journalists or prosecutors he could intimidate. These were his peers, billionaires themselves, who understood that his crimes had made them all look like fools. The Environmental Protection Agency is reviewing the contracts for the Morocco Resort project. Another board member added, "The Arabic version contains environmental impact warnings that were completely omitted from our English copies. We've been party to illegal construction that's destroyed protected wetlands. The labor agreements for the Dubai Towers show a completely different pay structure than what we approved," said another. "We thought we were paying fair wages. The reality is we've been funding what amounts to modern slavery." One by one, they detailed the discrepancies Eleanor's translations had revealed. Conditional clauses presented as guarantees. Environmental disasters hidden by linguistic sleight of hand. Labor violations disguised by mistranslation. Tax avoidance schemes that bordered on money laundering. Karim tried to bluster, to charm, to intimidate, all the tactics that had worked for decades. But the evidence was overwhelming, and his audience was no longer impressed by wealth they now knew was built on lies. The vote was unanimous. Karim Al-Mansour was removed as CEO and stripped of his board positions. Across the entire corporate empire he'd built, security escorted him from buildings that bore his name. Past employees who'd once feared him and now looked at him with the disdain usually reserved for common criminals. The media coverage was relentless. News outlets that had once printed his press releases verbatim now competed to expose new layers of his fraud. The same magazines that had put him on their covers as a business genius now ran stories about his spectacular fall from grace. Billionaire's empire built on lies screamed headlines around the world. The waitress who brought down a fraud. Respect costs nothing. How one sentence exposed massive corporate corruption. But perhaps the most damaging coverage came from former employees who finally felt safe to speak. Secretaries talked about being screamed at for bringing the wrong coffee. Drivers described being berated for traffic they couldn't control. Security guards shared stories of watching Kareem humiliate service workers for sport. The pattern was clear. Kareem's cruelty to Eleanor hadn't been an aberration. It was his standard operating procedure. He'd built his empire not just on financial fraud, but on systematic dehumanization of anyone he considered beneath him. International warrants were issued. Swiss banks froze accounts. The FBI raided properties across 3 states. Assets were seized, offices were shuttered, and the global business empire that had taken 20 years to build was dismantled in a matter of weeks. Kareem, who had once commanded respect through fear, now found himself completely alone. His wealthy friends stopped taking his calls. His political connections abandoned him. His own family distanced themselves from the scandal. The man who had never experienced consequences for his actions was drowning in them. Meanwhile, Eleanor Carter continued working at Sterling Grand, though now as something of a legend. Customers asked specifically for her section. Co-workers who had once avoided her now spoke of her with genuine respect. She'd become proof that sometimes, just sometimes, the powerful could be held accountable for their cruelty. But Eleanor hadn't changed. She still arrived early for her shifts, still treated every customer with professional courtesy, still went home to help Michael with his homework. The only difference was that now, when wealthy patrons were rude to service staff, other customers spoke up. Eleanor's example had given permission to others to demand the basic respect that should have been given freely all along. The ripple effects extended far beyond one restaurant. Videos of Eleanor's courtroom testimony were shown in business ethics classes. Her story became a case study in law schools about the power of truth-telling. Labor organizers used her example to encourage workers to speak up against mistreatment. Respect costs nothing became more than a viral quote. It became a movement. Workers across the country began wearing buttons with the phrase. Restaurant owners posted signs reminding customers to treat staff with dignity. The sentence that had silenced a ballroom was now empowering voices everywhere. 6 months after the gala, Kareem Al-Mansour sat in a sparse hotel room, staring at his laptop screen with bloodshot eyes. Once, he'd owned penthouses on 3 continents. Now, he couldn't afford a decent apartment. His assets were frozen, his accounts seized, his empire reduced to a pile of legal documents and criminal charges. The FBI had raided his properties, finding evidence of fraud spanning to decades. International prosecutors were building cases for tax evasion, money laundering, and environmental crimes. His lawyers, the few who hadn't abandoned him when the money dried up, spoke in terms of plea bargains and minimum sentencing guidelines. But the legal consequences, devastating as they were, paled in comparison to the social destruction. Kareem had spent his entire adult life believing that wealth equaled worth, that money commanded respect, that power meant never having to face consequences for cruelty. Eleanor Carter had shattered that illusion so completely that he no longer understood who he was in a world where his money couldn't buy silence. The isolation was crushing. Friends who had laughed at his jokes now avoided him like a disease. Business associates refused to return calls. Even his own family had cut contact, unwilling to be associated with his disgrace. The man who had never been alone in his life was discovering what true powerlessness felt like. Late at night, Kareem found himself obsessively watching the video of that moment in the ballroom. He'd memorized every word, every gesture, every second of his humiliation. He replayed Eleanor's calm response over and over, trying to understand how someone he'd considered barely human had brought down everything he'd built. Respect costs you nothing, and somehow you can't afford even that. The words haunted him because he was finally beginning to understand their truth. He had everything money could buy: jets, yachts, mansions, political influence. But he'd never had the one thing that couldn't be purchased: genuine respect from other human beings. His cruelty hadn't been a side effect of success. It had been his entire identity. He defined himself not by what he built, but by whom he could tear down. And now, stripped of the power to hurt others, he was forced to confront the emptiness where his humanity should have been. Meanwhile, Eleanor Carter's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The legal defense fund that had started with small donations from strangers had grown into something much larger. People from around the world sent money not just for her legal costs, but to support her. And Michael's education. Universities reached out with scholarship offers. Publishers wanted her to write a book. Speaking bureaus invited her to share her story at conferences and events. The woman who had never imagined leaving her neighborhood was suddenly being offered opportunities that seemed like fantasies. But Eleanor approached her newfound prominence with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her response to Kareem's cruelty. She accepted a partial scholarship to study literature, fulfilling a dream she'd set aside years earlier, but continued working part-time to support herself and Michael. When reporters asked about her plans, she smiled and said, "I want to learn, and I want to help other people find their voices. Beyond that, I'll see what opportunities present themselves." The speaking invitations she accepted were at community colleges, labor unions, and workers' rights organizations. She wasn't interested in celebrity. She was committed to using her platform to amplify the voices of other invisible workers who faced the same disrespect she'd endured for years. Michael thrived in the aftermath of his sister's courage. His own scholarship offers multiplied, and his essay about the true meaning of respect won a national writing competition. But more importantly, he'd learned from Eleanor's example that speaking truth to power wasn't just admirable, it was necessary. She taught me that respect isn't something you earn through accomplishments, he wrote in his winning essay. It's something you deserve simply by being human. And that's something no amount of money can change. The broader impact of Eleanor's story continued to ripple outward. Restaurant chains instituted new training programs about treating service workers with dignity. Business schools added courses on ethical leadership and the human costs of corporate culture. The phrase "respect costs nothing" appeared on everything from coffee mugs to congressional speeches. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in the countless small interactions between customers and service workers that happened every day across the country. Eleanor had given permission for people to expect better, to demand basic human courtesy, to understand that economic inequality didn't justify emotional cruelty. Servers found customers more polite. Cleaning staff experienced fewer insults. Retail workers faced less verbal abuse. Eleanor's single moment of courage had created space for millions of other moments of dignity. The criminal trial of Kareem Al-Mansour became an international spectacle. Prosecutors from 3 countries presented evidence of fraud stretching back 15 years. The same Arabic contracts that Eleanor had translated in her defamation case became the centerpiece of a massive criminal prosecution. Eleanor was called as a key witness, her linguistic skills now recognized as crucial evidence. In one of the largest corporate fraud cases in history, she took the stand with the same calm dignity that had characterized her throughout the ordeal, translating document after document that revealed the scope of Kareem's deception. The man who had once mocked her education and intelligence was now watching helplessly as her knowledge destroyed him in the most public way possible. Eleanor didn't gloat or show satisfaction. She simply told the truth, as she had from the beginning. The conviction was swift and comprehensive. Fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, environmental crimes. The charges read like a catalogue of corporate corruption. Kareem Al-Mansour was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution in the hundreds of millions. But the most devastating moment came during the victim impact statements. One by one, people Kareem had hurt over the years took the stand to tell their stories. Former employees talked about the psychological damage of his verbal abuse. Investors described the financial ruin his fraud had caused. Environmental groups detailed the ecological destruction his projects had hidden. Eleanor chose to speak last. She stood at the podium, looking across the courtroom at the man who had tried to destroy her life, and spoke words that would be remembered long after the legal proceedings were forgotten. Mr. Al-Mansour spent years believing that wealth made him superior to other people. He used his money as a weapon to hurt anyone he saw as beneath him. But money can't buy character, and wealth can't purchase basic human decency. Today, he's learning that respect truly costs nothing, and that arrogance costs everything. Kareem sat slumped in his chair, a broken man who finally understood the price of a lifetime spent crushing other people's dignity. For the first time, he was seeing the world from the perspective of those he'd victimized, powerless, voiceless, and completely at the mercy of a system that didn't care about his comfort. The sentencing made international headlines. Billionaire gets 25 years for fraud exposed by waitress. Respect costs nothing. Arrogance costs everything. The woman who brought down an empire. But Eleanor's story wasn't really about revenge. It was about the power of truth and the importance of human dignity. She had never set out to destroy Kareem Al-Mansour. She had simply refused to accept that wealth gave anyone the right to treat her as less than human. 2 years after that fateful night at the Sterling Grand Ballroom, Eleanor Carter walked across the stage at the university graduation ceremony. Her literature degree earned through years of part-time study while working and caring for Michael. The crowd's applause was thunderous, but the moment that mattered most was seeing Michael in the audience, tears streaming down his face with pride. She had been offered the opportunity to give the commencement speech, and her words resonated far beyond the graduates in attendance. Asterisk education isn't just about accumulating knowledge. It's about understanding your responsibility to use that knowledge with integrity and compassion. Success isn't measured by what you can take from the world, but by what you can give back to it. And respect isn't something you earn through achievements. It's something you owe to every person you meet, regardless of their circumstances. After graduation, Eleanor could have chosen any number of lucrative opportunities: book deals, speaking tours, consulting positions. The offers were endless. Instead, she chose to return to her community, opening a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting working-class families pursuing education. The Eleanor Carter Foundation provided scholarships, tutoring, and advocacy for people like her younger self. Brilliant individuals whose potential was being wasted because society had written them off based on their economic circumstances. Her first major donation came from an unexpected source: Klaus Ibrahim, the investor who had witnessed her courage firsthand and wanted to support her vision of a more equitable world. Michael graduated high school as valedictorian and was accepted to MIT on a full scholarship. His essay about dignity and respect inspiring admissions officers across the country. But more importantly, he carried forward his sister's example, treating everyone he met with the kind of respect that had started a revolution in a ballroom. As for Kareem Al-Mansour, he spent his days in a federal prison, finally experiencing the powerlessness he had inflicted on others for decades. Some prisoners knew his story and treated him with the same contempt he had once shown to service workers. Others simply ignored him, treating him as the irrelevant figure he had become. In rare moments of reflection, Kareem sometimes understood what Eleanor had tried to teach him: that respect and dignity weren't commodities to be bought and sold, but fundamental human rights that belonged to everyone. But understanding came too late to change the trajectory of his life or repair the damage he had caused. The viral video of Eleanor's response was still circulating years later, shared by new generations who found inspiration in her courage. Respect costs nothing had become more than a catchphrase. It was a principle that influenced how people treated each other in workplaces, schools, and communities around the world. But perhaps the most profound change was in Eleanor herself. The young woman who had once felt invisible in rooms full of powerful people now commanded respect wherever she went, not because of fame or recognition, but because she had proven that dignity and truth were more powerful than money and influence. She never forgot the lessons of her struggle: that every person deserves respect, that truth will eventually prevail over lies, and that sometimes the most important moments in history happen when ordinary people refuse to accept that wealth and power give anyone the right to treat others as less than human. Eleanor Carter's story spread far beyond the walls of the sterling Grand Ballroom, inspiring millions of people around the world who had ever felt powerless in the face of wealth and privilege. Her single sentence, "Respect costs you nothing, and somehow you can't afford even that," became a rallying cry for dignity in an increasingly unequal world. The phrase was translated into dozens of languages, quoted by world leaders, and taught in schools as an example of how courage can change everything. But Eleanor knew that her words had power not because they were clever or memorable, but because they expressed a fundamental truth that every human being deserves respect, regardless of their economic status or social position. The impact of her courage continued to ripple outward years after that confrontation. Workers felt more empowered to speak up against mistreatment. Customers became more conscious of how they treated service workers. Business leaders began to understand that true success required treating all people with dignity and respect. Eleanor's story proved that in a world where wealth often seems to determine worth, one person's courage can remind everyone that respect, dignity, and truth are values that money cannot buy, and that sometimes the most powerful people in the world can be brought low by someone who simply refuses to accept that cruelty is the price of inequality. The waitress who silenced a billionaire didn't just expose one man's fraud. She reminded the world that every person has the right to be treated with basic human respect. And that lesson, spoken in a moment of quiet courage in a glittering ballroom, continues to inspire people to stand up for their dignity and demand the respect that belongs to all of us. Because in the end, respect truly does cost nothing, and there's no excuse for anyone, no matter how wealthy or powerful, being unable to afford it. This script tells the complete story of Eleanor Carter and Kareem Al-Mansour, exploring themes of dignity, respect, power, and justice. It's structured for a YouTube video format with clear chapters and compelling narrative arcs that maintain viewer engagement throughout the entire story.